I don't know whether or not you're going to make more money. I would certainly inquire about what profession the person was in. What's the ceiling? What are we looking at right? We're going to look at it tactically. Okay. Because there's simple things people can do. Right. But the work that we're going to do is looking at what are the motivations for making more money if it's not survival? Mm-hmm. What's feeding it? That motivational source, is it a healthy fuel or is it an unhealthy fuel? Because I don't want you to make more money if we're just going to leverage shame and that's not helping, right? So I want to look at the fuel source, and I want to deeply understand your relationship to money. Where did it come from? How did you get informed around money? What shaped you as a kid around money so that we can understand, okay, if you really just want to tactically earn more money, it's doable. There's more money to be earned out there. So what's getting in the way?
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Hey, it's Srini. So I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you're listening to the show. And if you found the podcast fascinating, instructive, inspiring, or maybe even heartwarming, if there's one person you could think of who would appreciate our show, a friend or a family member, take a moment and share the show with them, because good ideas are meant to be shared. Sarah, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So I actually came across your story by way of somebody on your team who wrote in. And when I did some digging, as we were saying just before we hit record here, I liked the fact that your work was backed by research, that you were actually a licensed therapist, as opposed to, spouting, inspirational psychobabble that doesn't lead to any real results. But before we get into your work, I want to start by asking you, what is one of the most important things that you learned from one or both of your parents when you were growing up that shaped and influenced who you've become and what you've decided to do with your life?
Okay, I love your questions. Okay, so I'm going to separate them out, and each person, I think I can say something that's quite authentic. So from my mother, I think what she taught me was that it's never too late to start over. And from my father, I learned that you can survive much more than you think you can.
So how did that impact, sort of the direction that your life has taken?
Well, unconsciously, I think profoundly. Consciously, I probably never really thought about it at any level until, I'm in my mid 40s now. And that seems to come, at least for women, with a very reflective stance. And my experience working with men, it's the same thing. So, that midlife sort of gives you a perch to kind of look back on. And so now, turning a conscious eye to it, I see really clearly that it's led to this ability, I think this ability that I have to just keep going, just keep on taking what unfolds in front of you and metabolize it and use it as fuel. And I think really important from my mother is that, I watched her as the same gendered child reinvent a life at 55. She and my father separated. And so that just relieved me unconsciously of any sense that sometimes people get I'm too old or it's too late or, all of that. For me, that just didn't ever dawn on me. Didn't cross my mind.
Yeah, I guess the question for me is how do people undo that idea, that narrative that it is too late? I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons for me, the motivation for creating this conference that we're having in April was the idea that, your reality is malleable, but you spent your entire life believing that it's fixed. And yet millions of people believe exactly what you're saying you didn't. And I wonder, if you've gotten to the point in adult life where you're stuck with this belief that, wait a minute, you can't go up and upend something. Particularly you go up in an Indian family. If we tell our parents something like, I'm going to quit this crazy job as a doctor or whatever and go pursue something that has no guarantee, our parents would question our minds. I mean, they question our sanity even when we do it when we're young.
It's true. So how do we do it? How do we undo it?
Yeah. How do you unwind that narrative? How do you unwind that belief?
Well, the first thing is it's a lot of work. And the second thing is that most of us, at least the people that I work with in my experience as a human, is that the things that really are at the helm of our directional compass, we aren't actually aware of. They are in the unconscious. So the first thing is you have to just become aware of what it is. I reference it as like these sabotaging patterns, and these kinds of beliefs. Often they hide in, I always ask clients, do you live by a motto? And what I'm listening for isn't something, I mean, it's great to hear it from the vantage point of like, oh, wow, this really like is an anthem they live by, but I'm actually listening for a different level of messages there, kind of the underbelly of it. So a lot of times you're going to come across these kinds of limiting beliefs that they're not even aware of by getting to unconscious content. And then it's a lot of work. Not always. There's an element of the unconscious that's just completely adaptive to how our brain works. But there is a region of our unconscious that's governed by sort of whatever our traumas were, right? And I follow the Gabor Mate theory of trauma. Trauma isn't what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. And so that's a big enough net that everybody's got something. And right, I had to find one that was big enough to encompass all of it. And so, eventually you're going to find these thought patterns, belief patterns, behavioral patterns. Our habits hide a lot of these kinds of beliefs. So then you're going to have to work tirelessly and doggedly to first learn how to observe when it's happening. Then you can see it as it's happening. Then you can get a shoulder length ahead of it. But that process is grueling.
So I wonder, as somebody who's a therapist who has been trained professionally to help people with these kinds of issues, are you immune to them, or do you find yourself wrestling with the same issues that you are helping your clients and patients with?
Oh yeah, no. Not immune. Not immune at all. I am more human than otherwise. And the goal isn't immunity, right? So, because that still goes on this spectrum of trying to find like a cure for our human condition. It's not immunity. Nobody's immune. And a lot of times, once I'm working with somebody, you can see elements of shame sort of melt away because I really believe this. And I'm very honest. I mean, I don't make the therapy hour about me by a long shot. I'm sure my patients would attest, like, yeah, she's very, kind of keeps herself out of it. But I do reference, like, I get it. This is really hard. I got all my own shit. I got my own stuff that holds me back. So yeah, no. Unfortunately, were it to be.
Yeah. So what do you think the role of parents in all of this is? What do you think the role of schools is in all of this? And one thing that I think that when I look back now at adulthood and I think about sort of what the role of schools is and teaching people how to manage their psychology, the role seems like absolutely nothing. Like I've said that to me, a high school guidance counselor was like a glorified secretary that helped me plan my schedule. No offense to those of you who are listening who are high school guidance counselors, but it seems like this is a really, really big issue that is left out of our childhood. Like, we don't talk about mental health in the Indian community. It's incredibly taboo and it's incredibly stigmatized. I mean, I literally, for probably 36 years of my life, thought therapy was for crazy people until I ended up in a therapist office. And I was like, why the hell did I wait so long to do this?
I'm glad you had that experience. That's great, especially to have as your first experience. That's such a great question about, especially the one about the role of schools. It's hard for me as a parent, and an imperfect one at that, to kind of like theoretically pontificate about what the role of parents is, because generally what I've found is that at the heart of most parents, it are people who really are doing their best, and they love their children and they want the best for their children. So usually I try and parent work to really kind of, again, work with all the things you're touching on that are really important. Like there's cultural layers, there's ethnic layers, there's religious layers, there's gender layers, right? So I really kind of try to take it case by case by case. I know for me as a parent, I'm trying to hold, some really firm, non-negotiable boundaries while being flexible enough to stay open to who my kid is. And, I have an 11-year-old, and that's unfolding and it's ever changing. And so I have to be flexible with that. And lots of things that I thought theoretically would be something I would, either something my parents did that I would carry on, or something they didn't do that I would have done. And, as life teaches you, what the hell did I know when it was theoretical, right? But
Yeah.
the school thing is really interesting because they spend the most hours there, So I think that, and it inherently gets also tied up in a kind of have and have not dialogue. So a lot of times when I'm talking about this, I hear from people and they're like, well, yeah, that's great if you can afford, a private school. And it's true. But the education system is a space where if you can choose a charter school, if you're in a space where you can choose a private school, that there's a lot of options of how your child's neurobiology, how their curiosity, how they approach learning versus thinking. Like I didn't learn how to think until I was a freshman at Georgetown. And I sat in on there's a class, it's a Jesuit university. There's a class that every single freshman when I was there had to take, and it's called The Problem of God. And you study Nietzsche and atheists. And to me, that was mind blowing. It was like, I was sitting there thinking to myself, like, they don't want me to learn. They want me to think. And that's when I was like, oh, I was a mediocre student in high school and entirely disengaged from the learning process. And my high school was a great high school. I loved my high school. But for whatever reason, the learning style in a bunch of those classes didn't engage me. But when I got to college and it was really a different ball game, that really sparked my passion. So for me, I chose a school in Honolulu for my kid that's a progressive education model, and it's worked really well for him, for who he is. And I see him as a totally different learner than I was as a kid. Yeah. And especially, he's in 5th grade, and I remember we have long-term memory at 5th grade. I remember 5th grade, and I remember how checked out I was.
I remember a very awkward sex education tape. That's the extent of my memory from 5th grade. And I remember I quickly figured out that I was not cool and that there were cool people.
Oh my God, that is hysterical.
People.
So you were right on cue, because in 5th grade, you're in latency age. So you're just on the cusp of puberty, unless you had puberty sort of early. We all know those kids in our circle when we were growing up who did. And so, yeah, you're going to remember the sex ed class that made sex sound awful, and sterile and routine. And then, yes, you're going to be worried about the pack that you fit in. So you were completely on time. Yeah.
So, it's funny because you're talking about having, a kid be able to go to sort of a progressive school. And in a lot of ways, I see education as a one-size-fits-all solution. And one of the other things that, as you were saying, that I think about is the fact that being able to deal with your mental health, it seems like it's really only something that people of privilege really have the luxury of.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it just, and I wonder, what do you think about that? How do you deal with that issue? Because it seems like the people who really probably could benefit more so than the people of privilege are those who come from far less privileged circumstances. So I think about it. I posted this story on Facebook about your limitations versus the limitations of people who have real ones. So I had this driver in India when I was there for about 4 months or not 4 months, 4 weeks for a surf trip. And my cousin was telling me, he said, look, what you get paid to do in a 1 hour talk, this guy lives off of for an entire year. And you know what he does? He drives up a treacherous mountain road 9 hours each way to take tourists up this mountain 3 to 4 times a week. And of all the pictures that I wanted to get printed and framed, that was the one that I intended to do that with, which I will, mainly because I wanted that as a perpetual reminder of how much easier I have it than that guy does.
Mm-hmm. Perspective is everything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're totally right. It's true. And so, when you're in training, you're often, like, I was working in community mental health clinics and inpatient settings. I did some forensics, so I was in prisons and jails. So you're in all these settings and you get trained in this sort of battleground where you're right, that the kind of socioeconomic status is what either gets you past the velvet ropes or not. And so it's true. I do think we're in a period of time where mental health is being destigmatized in ways. This is probably, we probably owe a thanks to social media in this regard. And I don't have many thanks to social media, but this is one of them,
Yeah.
where, people are finding a forum to normalize the experiences of our human condition. And for me, I really shifted a couple of years ago my focus entirely away from sort of seeking out what is wrong with people and pathology into wellness. And then I want to say something to your really good question that was embedded in there, which is, how do you deal with this as a therapist, this sort of inherent baked in problem that the people that need good psychiatric and psychological care have the least access to it. So for me, ever since I opened a private practice, I take a certain number of people per, a percentage per my whole roster of people for like $20 a session. So that's how I do it. Everybody does it differently, right? Some people do volunteer work. Some people, figure out that way. But for me, when I became really clear that in order to work in the realm that felt like it was really my strength, I was going to have a private practice. And that was going to necessitate, working with people that could pay for it. So that's how I solved it. And, it's been for me a good solution.
So I have one other question about parenting, and I've yet to find an answer to this question. It's funny because I've heard so many different things about parenting. Despite not being a parent, to me, this is one of those things that I think, like you, I'm delusional in thinking that, okay, I'm going to have talked to all these people, so I'll be this very self-actualized, enlightened parent. But then people like Philip McKernan, who, the guy could read a phone book and it's inspiring. Like, my favorite thing he's ever said about parenting is, like, no matter what you do, you're going to fuck your kids up. And
you're going to fuck them up big time.
So the question that I've asked a number of people in your position is, how is it that you can have 2 kids who are raised in the exact same environment with the exact same parents who are given the exact same advice and end up with wildly different results based on that advice? Me and my sister are a perfect example of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how does that happen?
I'm the youngest of 6, so I totally get it. I don't know that I have the definitive answer on that, but I would say this because I have an opinion on anything, right? But this is just an opinion. I would say my experience has been that we come to the world with a temperament, and temperament is fixed. personality develops, character develops over time. And then you layer in as well that we have genetic components, right? So certain genetics get expressed, certain ways. Then you have the personality that develops over time as it interacts with its ever widening environment. But you also, at the time of birth, you've been forming for 9 months, and epigenetically, that's also been forming you. And so I think we come to the world with temperament styles. And those temperament styles are fixed. The role of the parent is to leverage its upside and mitigate its downside. And every temperament style has two sides to the coin. One side, it's going to be your greatest strength. You flip that same coin over, and it's going to be your biggest vulnerability.
Hmm. It's funny because I think for me, I always say, I dealt with attention issues and a short attention span my entire life. Yet the flip side of that very thing is the fact that I have that allows me to focus intensely on things I care about in a way that I couldn't on things I don't give a shit about.
Yeah, 100%. And universally, I have found, and I'm not the only one that's found this, that kids who in childhood, quote unquote, had attention problems, I would even argue with that phrase, that's that you didn't fit a norm that has been called the preferred attention style. But that doesn't mean you actually, and you might have been the small percentage of people when I did psych testing that said, wow, this really is sort of a neurologic attention issue happening. That happened very rarely in my practice, assessing people in that way. Most of us have our style. If we don't fit the bell curve, then we have a problem. Then we grow up with this narrative, I had attention problems. I would say probably your attention style is the same attention style that you see in a lot of entrepreneurs. And actually, it's often paired when at the CEO level, it's usually paired with some sort of dyslexic process in there as well. It seems like the dyslexic brain learns how to read a room and see a gestalt, see the whole system in a way that people who process things typically when it comes to reading don't. And you later on see them age into these sort of visionary styles, this charming leadership ability, and all these secondary muscles that developed as a result of a quote disorder that are now their best asset. And I think you're probably describing that you are another one of those people in my experience of a long lineage of people who as a kid, it was a problem. And as an adult, it's your it's your golden goose.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I think Simon Sinek told me once, he said, your why is that you're obsessed with people who are good at unusual things. And when I look back at all the people I interviewed, I said, yeah, that's a pretty accurate reflection of what I've done with my career. And I didn't recognize that until about a couple of months ago. But one other thing I wonder about this, you were talking about a couple of things. One, you mentioned, social media has been a, good thing in terms of destigmatizing mental health. To me, there's a paradox at play here because social media has also been one of the greatest causes of a lot of mental health issues. And I can tell you this because every time I see my literary agent share a book by, one of her other clients, some of who have been guests here, I think to myself, where did I fuck up? Because this person sold 1 million books. Like, why am I not doing that? And I noticed, I was like, wow, this is fueling my tendencies for envy and comparison, which are wildly inaccurate. But so I wonder, when you look at it from the mental health perspective, yes, we're able to destigmatize it by having a conversation about it. And on the flip side of that, a lot of this is contributing to our mental health issues.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this up. And I've so many thoughts. Okay. Let me be clear right from the start that I am the kind of person who came reluctantly to social media, and I'm essentially an introvert that can be very outgoing. So I came very reluctantly, and I knew it was holding me back. When I thought about when I think, so I'm 44, I thought, okay, let's say you get 10 more years. Let's say that was your checkout time. What would swing for the fences look like? And for me, I want to write a book. And I know there's lots of people like the late great Anthony Bourdain, who like wrote one article for a free magazine and then 12 days later had a book deal. That hasn't been my narrative. So I'm going to have to slog it out like the rest of them. And I'm going to go 18 rounds. And that's all right. So I was like, I got to get in the game, because everybody I spoke to was like, you have to essentially have like an audience, right? So here I am. I'm in the game now. I've made some provisions. I have somebody that I work with that does a lot of the stuff that feels like I don't want to do it, or I don't want to take the time to do it. So I've made some concessions, and here I am. And so I come reluctantly for all the reasons you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And you're right. I don't know that our job, or my job, is to even reconcile that is true, that yet again, here is another example of how something it's a coin, and on one side, it has all this great stuff, and then you flip it over, and on the other side, it is the seedy underbelly of our human tendencies. I can't reconcile that. But what I can do as a human and as a therapist is, like, if I were working with you, we would really look at that, and we would start to take that pathway backwards. That's a root system that's showing you spaces inside yourself that have, I call them injuries, or pain points. And it's a way to continue to learn about ourselves. Like, we can't control the keyboard warriors. We can't even really do anything about it. But it's here. And, now if we're talking about kids, like my kid isn't on social media, you got to come up with provisions to help your children navigate this, because a child's brain isn't as developed as an adult brain, and neither is their emotional and psychological interior. And so they are still it's like they're exoskeletal, but they don't have a skeleton. They are fragile. Their soft underbelly is exposed all the time, and we have to protect them from that. But as an adult, it's enter at your own risk. Know that you're gonna bump up against yourself in there, and you're gonna bump up against everybody else's stuff.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to iRobot.com/unmistakable. So it's interesting to hear you talk about this. I mean, I know this sort of audience building thing, obviously, because I've lived it. I've gotten the book deal, I've done all of that, and I thought it was going to mentally solve. So we'll get to this, because this is something that I've been thinking about. Is Ryan Holiday was here just a few weeks ago. And the funny thing is, he said, like, no accomplishment is going to make you feel as good as you think it will. And I'm thinking to myself, and literally the next day, Ryan posted a picture on Instagram of his 8th book hitting the New York Times bestseller list. And I'm struggling to get past like a proposal for another book deal on book number 3. That's a whole other aside. But I think that this is something, and I came across this quote that I think is very relevant. So one of the things that you said earlier is that there's certain aspects of our personality and temperament that are fixed. And yet every aspect of our culture today, every aspect of this sort of self-improvement narrative, I mean, hell, the entire Unmistakable Creative is about becoming this sort of better idealized version of you that you aren't today. And So this quote is something that I came across in Heather Havlesky's latest book, What If This Were Enough? And she said, there is not a better version of you waiting in the future. The best version of you is who you are right here, right now, in this fucked up, impatient, imperfect, sublime moment. Shut out the noise and enjoy exactly who you are and what you have right here, right now. And yet, that is so hard to do. That is so difficult to do, because what do? We listen to people like you come and talk to people like me, specifically because we're not okay with who we are today, and because we believe that there is some better version of us in the future that is better looking, has more money, whatever it is, like this external accomplishment. So how, as somebody who is a therapist who does help people change their lives, I thought of the title in my head for your interview, and that is, how do you change your life without losing your mind?
Oh my God, that's such a good title. Sometimes I get title envy. That's one of them. So good. And it just rolled right off your tongue. That's such a great, it is really it's a great question. And the truth is, so for me, I am in the industry of change. That's the game I'm in. People come to me because they want to change something. But once they're in my lair, as I like to call it, they very quickly realize that my motto is that it is not in the doing, it is in the being. And people want homework from me, and they want like all these like actionable things. And most of the time, once you've spent any stretch of time working with me, you're going to realize that I don't think you're broken. I don't actually think you need improvement. That is the guise under which you came to me. Change will happen, because once we start to deeply self-observe and have radical self-awareness, things lift. We move through traumas. We heal some scar tissue. We challenge ourselves in ways that grows resiliency and grit. So we grow and we change, but that's destination oriented. And I've worked tired. Well, first of all, let me say this. In my practice, you pay me to not be destination addicted. In my personal life, it's something I've worked 44 years, both consciously and unconsciously, to release myself from that vice grip. That when I get there, I'll be fill in the blank. It's all bullshit. It's not true. You won't be. When you get 8 New York Times bestsellers, you're going to go home and still inhabit the carcass that you're walking around in right now. And the basic elements of that is like, it's you against you. It's an inside job. So, but I do believe, and I feel in my own life as a person, and I see this with the people who end up in my office, that their change happens, but it isn't actually my goal. It's not what I go in looking for. What I go in looking for is connection, because it's always the relationship that heals, basically. And I go in looking to be freakishly curious about the parts of yourself that you aren't even aware of right now. And those are my guiding first principles when we're working together. And then, my experience has been that we keep evolving, or we devolve. I mean, we have lots of examples currently of people devolving right in front of our eyes. And, but there's always movement. Change is always happening.
Yeah. So it's interesting, because as you're saying that, I know that you work with Stephen at the Flow Research Collective, which is all about high performance. So how do those two things coexist? How do you aim to achieve the kinds of levels of performance that, people who Stephen talks about achieve? We're talking, sort of the Peter Diamandis of the world, the Elon Musks, the crazy surfers and snowboarders who are doing these just insane things, which are levels of performance and destinations that everybody's trying to reach. How do you have those two things coexist?
They coexist perfectly. In fact, I'd argue that you can't have one without the other. If you take it this way, when I talk about radical self-awareness, like some of the levels that I'm talking about are at the self-regulation level, literally the central nervous system, right? We can enter self-awareness. We can do it through embodiment. We can do it through breath. Sometimes you do it through pain. Sometimes you do it through loss. Sometimes you do it through envy. You enter it in all these different arenas, right? And risk taking is one that puts you right there. You cannot avoid yourself when all the chips are on the line. You can't. It's just you up against you. And so to me, this work, and I'm so like, the turn of events of connecting up with Stephen and getting to be part of what he's building at the Flow Research Collective, I'm psyched because for a long time I was working in my private practice this way with executives in Honolulu, where I live, and thinking to myself, like, I didn't even know about this world really. This is like 5 years ago. And then I read one of his books and then I was like, oh, this is like exactly what I'm doing, but at this deeply psychological level. So to me, like, I'm your ace in the hole if performance is your gig, because you can't escape you at every single level. You can think that you can, but you can't. And eventually everybody comes up against the edges of their, whether it's comfort zone or skill or belief in self. You find your edges when you're striving for greatness.
Wow.
And that's where I come in.
Wow. So I have one question about this related to performance. Then I want to actually go into a potentially tactical example, which might be difficult given what it is. But why do you get sort of varying degrees of performance? So, for example, multiple people could go to Stephen's Zero to Dangerous seminar. Some will come home and within weeks they will be this completely transformed person, or they will be the kind of person who didn't need to go there in the first place, but did, and it was sort of an amplifier. And I think this is just literally the entire self-development industry. And so I wonder, why do you get that? Like, what happens? Why is it, for example, that two people could take an online course, or even two people could listen to this interview, and one will walk away with a significant improvement and another will just kind of stay in this sort of cycle of, okay, I need to find the next fix?
It's just an awesome question that I don't know that I've ever been asked that way, but now that you've asked it, I'm happy. And I have a couple things. So one is, if you show up to a house with a hammer, you're going to find nails, or whatever that phrase is, right? So I'm a shrink. So for me, it's mindset. It's psychology. It's what's between the ears. And, most of us can sort of ride into sometimes even our middle age kind of on what we developed in our childhood, our style of orbiting in the world. But eventually the train stops and you got to kind of update, and you have to learn if the next level of performance, whatever that may be, you may be at any level in your life, there's a next level. That's why I opened the hour saying, the thing that I saw from my mother is that you can reinvent yourself at any time. Mm-hmm. It's really true. And so that's sort of the first thing, is that to me, the rubber meets the road with mindset and psychology. I have a particular sort of, I think, blend of talent and fascination with how our unconscious operates. I think it's where real work happens. So that's my shtick. But lots of people have a different space they like to work in, right? And that's great. But then you touched on something else that's there. I have observed that, and this is not like for every science buff out there, like I haven't done like double-blind studies. This is just anecdotal. But what I've found is that there's also people who have people reveal their sort of their preference for growth and change. And some people are transformers and some people are evolvers. The vast majority of us are evolvers. When you watch we follow, I am one of them. I have to do things over and over and over again to learn. And I require, time and reflection. That's sort of how I work. But there are people who are transformers. These are the people who, do kind of, you'll see it in the, I used to see it all the time when I was working like in addiction treatment centers. Like some people would, come in once into an inpatient setting. They'd stay 30 days and, they'd, next thing you knew, they were stringing together a decade of kind of this new life. But most people had to kind of keep coming back, right? And cobbling together the learning pattern. So you get lots of different types. And then there are people for whom, when I uncover the psychology piece of it, here's the hard, cold truth. A lot of people say they will do whatever it takes. It takes what it takes, right? But actually, they're busy, doing their psychology, which is mostly unconscious, whether it's they're coming up with excuses or they sabotage themselves through, time management issues or substance abuses, or they have these habits and patterns and belief systems that they're not even aware of while they're consciously saying, I will do whatever it takes. I would this, I was that. But when it really gets down to what it would take, they don't actually want to do that. And part of the role of a therapist is when you see that happening, it's not pleasant. And I don't like having to say to people, I actually think you wouldn't do whatever it takes. And here are 5 examples. But usually, I have found over the years that people can hear it once they really are connected to you and know, my patients feel the respect I have for the human condition. Like, I don't think I'm any better than anybody else. I'm just a slob trying to figure it out too.
So I think that raises another question for me. So we've had Justine Musk here, who was Elon Musk's ex-wife, to talk about the psychology of visionaries. But as a follow-up to that, I interviewed my old mentor, Greg Hartle, who he said something I think that was a harsh dose of reality, but it was very true. He said, we don't acknowledge the role that talent and intelligence play in people's accomplishments nearly enough, because he said that's not an inspiring story to say that, oh, Michael Phelps is Michael Phelps because he was born that way, because that's his physique and his genetics. Or the fact that most people are not going to be the next Oprah, Steve Jobs, or Beyonce. And yet there's a sort of narrative in popular culture. I mean, even if you look at, for example, somebody like Sarah Blakely's Instagram feed is incredibly motivating, incredibly inspiring. And let's be, harsh and real here. How many of the people who follow Sarah Blakely are going to follow in her footsteps? Probably not many, if any at all. And so I wonder, what is your response to that? Do you think that there are certain levels of accomplishment, like the Elon Musks, that just are not accessible to people?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I think that we're born with aptitudes. And within that aptitude, like, I was never going to become a theoretical physicist. Never. It was never, like, I was never, ever, ever going to. It wouldn't have mattered how much heart I had, truly. And by the way, at 44, I don't see that as a failure, right? Or even a shortcoming. I'm just like, okay, like, move on from it. So people have aptitudes. It's 100% true. And, but I will say that most people that I work with, they overvalue the role. Like, let's say once basic aptitude is met, okay, basic aptitude, then within that spectrum, like I am somebody who has a basic aptitude for writing. I've never been trained, right? But I've got my own style and I think it works. Okay. Within this spectrum, the only thing that would stop me from writing a book is me, period. That question is done and over in my mind. And I'm okay if at the end of my life that, if I don't get it done, I don't get it done. But it's on me. It's not the industry. It's not social media. It's not I didn't have time. I have time for what I make time for. But again, I'm in the basic aptitude. So it's true. And it's true. It is totally true. But what I see in my office is a lot of times people use this aptitude theory as a reason why, like, so why even start? Like, I'm never going to be that. And like, yeah, look, Elon Musk is Elon Musk because there's only one Elon Musk. And by the way, the world really sort of needs one Elon Musk and then a bunch of other people uniquely brilliant in their own way, right? All working together. Like it all works out. But I think you can have your version of whatever the gold ring is, like whatever that is, you can have that. But it has to be realistically based. It's, like I was never, there was lots of things I was never going to do. I was never going to be a model. I'm 5'3". Like it was never going to happen. So I do think honesty and knowing where your assets lie.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So let's use a concrete example. I think that likely people are going to be hearing this at the very beginning of the new year. And I think one of the goals that we all think we want at the beginning of a new year is, I want to make more money this year. So let's say that I came to you and said, Sarah, I'm, basically choosing to work with you because this is a problem that I want to solve. This is a problem that has persisted in my life. And like, where do we start? Like if I came to you and said that, what would you even say to me?
If you came to me and said, I want to make more money.
Yeah.
I would be really honest. And I would say the thing I said about destination stuff. And I would say that basically what I would say is I don't know whether or not you're going to make more money. I would certainly inquire about what profession the person was in. What's the ceiling? What are we looking at right? We're going to look at it tactically. Okay. Because there's simple things people can do. Right. But I would say the work that we're going to do is looking at what are the motivations for making more money if it's not survival? What's feeding it? What is that motivational source? Is it a healthy fuel or is it an unhealthy fuel? Because I don't want you to make more money if we're just going to like leverage shame and push you toward that's not helping, right? No. So I want to look at the fuel source and I want to deeply understand your relationship to money. Where'd it come from? How did you get informed around money? What shaped you as a kid around money so that we can understand, okay, if you really just want to tactically earn more money, it's doable. There's more money to be earned out there. And so what's getting in the way?
Yeah.
What is it inside of you that's getting in the way? I bet you it's not behavioral. It's not that you're not putting your resume in the right places. There's something else. And that's the journey that we would go on. And then there'd be things I'd have you do throughout the time that would surface as I got to know you at a deeply individual level. But every human being that sees me hears this same shtick.
No.
And anybody that's listening is probably like, oh God, I know what she's going to say. I would encourage every person who wants to embark on any process of evolving to learn to sit still. Learn to be completely still in your own skin and bones and try to do it for 10 minutes, Godspeed. And then report back to me. because that's the stuff I'm interested in. It's that stuff.
Sounds like you and I could potentially teach an entire course on this.
Totally. Let's put it on our New Year's resolution list.
I mean, seriously, maybe we should just teach a course together about the psychology of money. I don't think you'd have any shortage of takers.
Oh, none. And no shortage of data, because it's one of the most, it is one of the most shaping factors we bump up against from the moment we come into the world, from before. Just the medical care that money gains you access to shapes your relationship to money before you're even born.
Wow. So I want to go back to something that you said at the beginning of our conversation about what your dad taught you, and that was that we can survive far more than we think we can. And yet, I think that I know this from my own experiences, is that I have a tendency to catastrophize, to think, okay, like the world is going to fall apart. I'm going to be screwed. I'm going to be 50 years old living at my parents' house again. And
I love that you add the again. Again is just like perfectly placed. It's, that shame rearing its head.
So, you mean how I think that for a lot of people, often when I have conversations like this, I think we all intellectually understand what it is you're talking about, but emotionally understanding it and really feeling it is an entirely different thing. So I know, for example, that every time I thought the worst was going to happen, things ended up being better. So for example, we were really kind of like, okay, how are we going to make more money this year? And suddenly, Radio Public starts a venture fund to specifically invest in podcasts. And we literally fit all the criteria to the letter. And we raise our first round of venture funding. Suddenly, it's overnight a game changer in terms of how we can think about running Unmistakable.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, 6 months before that, I was beyond stressed out about how things were going.
Okay. So tell me the question.
So the question is, even if we know that we can survive far more than we think we can, why don't we, in the moment, embrace that? How do we deal with that in the moment and actually live that way in the moment is really the question.
Yeah. Such a great question. Okay. So this is a great example where, and I see this a lot in high achieving people, present company included, which is that oftentimes we have a very sort of, we have like a kind of love-hate relationship with control. And when we look at times in your life like that, right? 6 months, you're so stressed out, the outcome ends up being exactly in your favor, right? So it's like, oh, this is where people get the theory of like the universe has your back. So here's the thing. The universe does. I don't think the universe has your back. I don't have any evidence that, things are we can orbit in that sphere. But what I do know is that the outcome is going to be the outcome. And the only thing, and you don't know that outcome. You couldn't have known 6 months earlier that this turn of events would happen and that your vision would perfectly fit the vision of the venture people looking to dole out dough, right? You couldn't have known that because you're not a psychic. You're just a human that just can only see into right now, right? None of us really know the future. So the only thing you could ever really change would be how you orbit around the uncertainty of those 6 months. And that's where we can make a lot of inroads as we continue to do the work of self-awareness, self-reflection, all of that. You can actually change how you approach the stress, the perceived stress, right? Little did you know, you didn't even need to stress about that. You were blowing out your adrenals for zip because the universe was going to unfold a solution, or time was going to unfold a solution that would perfectly fit your need. But you didn't know that. So this is about control and uncertainty. And that we can always, always grow on. I mean, arguably, it's the thing, right?
Yeah.
It's at the core of like people's fears of death. It's at the core of hypochondriasis, right? Fears about the uncertainty of the outcome of really sort of life. And these are many examples.
Wow. I feel like I could do literally an entire part 2 with you, because it seems like we've focused entirely on the psychological aspects, but it seems like there's a part 2 here of, okay, what does this look like in practice for body and mind? I'm guessing that's probably a large part of this as well, right?
Totally. Yes. And there's, there's a lot that we do in the work as therapists and, coaches and people working in this sphere that kind of unfolds in the process of the work, right? But yeah, there's a lot of like tactical stuff whenever I'm talking about like self-regulation and anxiety or stress. That's what you were experiencing at a psychological level in those 6 months. And it has a whole body cost, right? It's not just that it makes us uncomfortable. The uncomfortable is actually the feelings. That's the only language your body has, and the sensations. Communicating that, like, your brain is releasing certain chemicals, you're releasing cortisol, you're living on adrenaline. It's changing your physical your physical experience. It influences us at a cellular level. So you can really enter in points of change at any turn on that dial. Mindfulness does it, food does it, hydration does it, sleep does it, movement does it. Obviously, stillness changed me in ways that movement never could. And so there's loads and loads of tactical stuff, breath work. And but the good stuff is down deep.
Wow.
Where it's just you against you, right? In the end, it's just, if you've ever watched anybody die, and I have, especially if it's somebody you really, really love, there's a certain place in the process of death where the person has retreated to be deep inside themselves. They are really, really contending with themselves. And that's where all the good stuff takes place.
Wow. I feel like I could actually talk to you for like another 4 or 5 hours about all of this. I do too. So I want to finish with one last question, which is how we finish all of our interviews. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
I know. And I'm like every other person because I listen to your podcast all the time. And, I'm like, I'm not going to be caught flat-footed. I'm going to come up with something. I'm going to come up with something that's just witty and fabulous. But when I play the game and I just received the question, right? What makes us unmistakable are all the parts of ourselves that we think make us fucked up. They make us fucked up. They make us different. They make us, stand out. All those things are what make us unmistakably us. And get to know those parts of yourself, because it's the ticket. It's the whole thing right there.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and share your stories and your insights with listeners. This has been one of my favorite conversations that I've had this year. Where can people find out more about you, your work, and everything that you're up to?
Okay, so my website is drdrsarahsarkis.com. I can also be found on I send out monthly blogs from there at the Padded Room. Also, I'm working with Stephen Kotler and the Flow Research Collective. We're doing really cool stuff too, so check them out. And I write a monthly column for him, Shrink Wrap, that goes out to his newsletter. So anybody that wants to sign up. And we sort of I get to cover like, anybody that just listened to this will understand sort of the jive that you're going to get from me in that monthly column. And it's really fun and provocative.
Amazing. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming. Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.